Hey, everybody. Morning. So I'm Mike. Pleasure to see you all. It's a lot colder here than it is where I'm from, in Austin. So I'm the guy behind Sails, or one of the people behind Sails, which is, if you're unfamiliar with it, an open source MVC framework for Node. How many of you guys have used Sails or are familiar with Sails? Great. OK, cool. So I'm mainly going to talk about open source in general today, but in the context of Sails, and kind of some stuff that I learned, as well as some stuff that I would carry on to the next open source project that I do. And if there's time, maybe we can do a little bit of coding as well. So I guess about 3 years ago now, I quit my job and started pursuing this Node.js thing, which quickly got out of hand from where it started, which was just kind of me in my house and a guy that dropped out of college and was kind of staying with me. And the other thing about Sails is we haven't raised any money. So all of the stuff we've done so far has basically been bootstrapped from doing services work. And I think that's been instructive. So the first thing, I guess, to know here is a little bit of the backstory. So officially, put together this company called Balderdash in 2012. And Balderdash was basically an entity that existed for me to be able to do a lawyer website. And myself and someone named Heather, who's a graphic designer, we got together and basically just, once again, it got a little out of hand. One of the biggest things I was interested in with doing the company in the first place was to get the opportunity to use Node on the back end. And I hadn't really gotten to use Node at work. So basically the way it worked was I would talk to people and say, hey, you probably want something built. And they would say yes. And then I would make them an app. And what ended up happening was, over time, building complete Node.js apps, all that stuff kind of started to crystallize into this framework. And that took about a year before we even really thought it would be a good idea to share it with anybody, just because we weren't really sure it worked completely yet. But really, it all kind of comes back to my weird hero admiration of Ryan Dahl that you'll see from all of these from these pictures. Have you all seen this video? The pink sweatshirt video, highly recommended. It's a really good one. But so these are some quotes. So the thing that was really cool about Node to me, beyond the obvious thing, which is like, oh wow, JavaScript all over the place, right? Like we don't have to context shift, was that here's this kernel programmer who was having to deal with this problem that he kept running into that was making apps slow. The fact that these things on the top here, like L1, L2, RAM, those are synchronous in Node, right? Like you can do a console.log and there's no callback. But the other kinds of operations, like writing to disk or like fetching from the network, are really slow, like 240 million times slower or so. So yeah, he gets excited and speaks in German. And the thing that was really cool about it was he was comfortable with saying, you know what? I don't need to make a C binding for this thing. I mean, I do, but why don't we just expose a scripting language on top of that so that next time me or someone else needs to do this, we can just do it in JavaScript. So yeah, he copied the browser. And basically, there's already a distinction in the browser because we have stuff like click events that work in this way because you can't lock the entire UI until someone clicks on something. So there you go. There's that timeout, and that was kind of the awesome thing that led to everything that Node is now. So the thesis for everything that I started doing about 3 years ago was, would it be possible to really just kind of ditch my Grails stack or ditch my PHP stack and just kind of jump over completely to Node? And up to that point, it was mainly like if you were doing chat, you would use Node, or if you were doing some kind of low-level infrastructural stuff, you would use Node. But the promise of it really was more than that, I thought. So And then, Ryan Dahl had these prophetic words where he basically says, what if someone wrote a web framework for Node, right? And he doesn't want to write it because he doesn't need to. He doesn't actually have to. He's not doing anything like that. He's using it at a low level. And he says, it'd be nice to have an ORM abstraction or something like that. So that just felt like he was just personally talking to me, I think. And so maybe it was just because I had quit my job and was getting a little crazy. But that's kind of where Sails came from. So Sails, just to kind of give a quick intro of what it actually is an MVC framework in the same way that Python has Django, or Ruby has Rails, PHP has Laravel, and many others. Groovy has just Grails, pretty much, and ASP.NET MVC and Spring for Java. So that's kind of like what Sails is for Node.js, right? And that's its place in the world. So the very first version of this thing was actually built to be part of a content management system that I was working on. And in the process of doing that, I started to put stuff in a familiar pattern that I was used to from other frameworks, like models and controllers. And then it kind of occurred to me, like, wow, maybe this is actually more useful because this content management system was pretty basic. It's kind of like what Firebase is now. And so, made it about a year that way. By the time Christmas rolled around, it's a slow time for services work. And I had a couple of weeks where I got to spend full time working on stuff. And so that's where Waterline came from. We'd been using something called SQLize, which is a great ORM for MySQL and Postgres and SQLite. But we needed to use Mongo because we had a lot of clients who wanted to use Mongo. So Waterline's goal was basically kind of mimic the multiple data source plugin in Grails, but do that in a way where you could do it in Node. So you could work with Mongo, you could work with Postgres, and you could put one model in Mongo and one model might be a MySQL table, and that would be fine. So that's currently, we have MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, and Redis as kind of the core supported adapters, as well as another little one called Sails Disk, which is the development-only adapter. And one thing that was really neat about Waterline in general, or just kind of getting into the low level of the framework, was that I realized that it would be possible to expose adapters at kind of the human level, right? At the normal programmer, everyday programmer level for people like me. And so, in your project, you can just make an adapters folder, and you can make a custom adapter to wrap around your weird old WebLogic thing or your LDAP thing, right? Or you can open source those things, and then other people can use them too. And that's what happened. We have a lot of community adapters now. So it wasn't until the beginning of that next year where we actually had some docs that I didn't write, but someone on our team wrote, and they were pretty all right, better than anything else we had. And hadn't really done anything to promote the framework. It was just sort of there. We'd open sourced it, and we'd left some install instructions and pretty much nothing else. And I posted this screencast in March, I think, or actually in February. And the next morning, I went to bed at 3, and I woke up, and there was 1,000 views. And I had just signed on 3 different client projects, and so it was just like, whoa, what's going on? So I didn't really pay much attention to it, and just kind of went about my business. And then Reddit hit in February, and then Hacker News hit, and there was 29,000 people looking at it. And then Hacker News hit again. And at that point, suddenly Sails became everything I was doing, which was really cool, actually, and a lot of fun. But it led to some interesting learning experiences about open source. This was really my first open source module, by the way, and really the only reason I even thought to do it was because of NPM, because it's just so easy. You just type NPM publish, and then suddenly you're an open source author. So, with one exception, I had a plugin for Groovy called Alcohol. It was a date formatting library. It made your dates prettier, and that was really bad. And the Grails community. There's a great plugin system, but it's not nearly half as good as what NPM brings to bear. So yet another really cool thing about Node. So anyways, after the first Hacker News thing happened, we finally decided it'd be a good idea to have a website, and did that. And there's this guy in Japan named Mike Thomas who's an excellent designer, but really got kind of carried away with this. I think he must have heard me say rub-a-dub-dub, 3 developers in a tub or something. And so he just kind of went with it. And so that's where all that came from. But meanwhile, we were finishing up probably one of the busiest times we'd had yet as a company with the 3 projects. And suddenly I realized that there was like 50 issues that had stacked up and all of these pull requests. And mainly questions more than anything else about like, how should I do this? And the only answer I had is like, well, here's how I do it normally, right? And so this is one of the first issues. This is actually before Hacker News. And that was someone trying to install and use Sails, and that was apparently at that time you didn't do Sails new, you just type Sails and then the name of the project, and it would just create the project. But if you did Sails lift, it just wouldn't work. So that was, there's a bit of an adjustment when other people start using your stuff, and you have to start using semantic versioning and all this stuff. And then what was really cool is Guillermo from Socket.io tweeted about us, and that made it a lot more real to me. And I actually got the opportunity to talk to him a few more times. But at the core of all this, and the reason why there was a lot of issues early on was mainly because there was no docs. But when the docs came, the issues didn't really slow down. And as the popularity of the project grew, I started to realize, we started off with the stuff that we were using, which was EJS and Less and PhoneGap. And we didn't really have much direct support for PhoneGap in there, but there was a way you could bundle up a project into this www folder, right? And you could deploy it on S3 as a single-page app, or put it in a PhoneGap project. So that was kind of what we were doing. But the thing is, everyone kind of does their own thing when it comes to the front end. And Sails is not really trying to solve that problem. But as soon as you get someone to buy into your technology, open source or not, suddenly they become dependent on you, and of course they need help, right? So then we had this thing called rigging, and like rigging had support for Sass and CoffeeScript and Less, and it was like this asset pipeline thing. But it was really bad because I didn't spend any time on it. And then Grunt kind of came into the picture, and now there's like more template languages, and Consolidate needed to be there. And so we cleaned all that up and basically said, look, we're just going to put Grunt at the forefront here, and that'll be a hook, and there's this new thing called hooks, and you can turn off and on hooks, and Grunt is how you're going to bundle up all this kind of front end stuff, or you can just disable it. We don't care. But what this meant was that all of the existing Grunt plugins would now solve the problems that rigging and then something called Asset Rack had begun to solve, and really failed to solve. So that was really good. And 0.9 is when Sails really got stable for the first time. And then Gulp happened. So and then now there's all of this with basically the Grunt stack. Now people want to use Gulp too, which is totally understandable. The problem is when you're the open source maintainer and you're not using Gulp, you get put into a tricky situation, right? So we solved that in 0.10 with this thing called generators, which lets you spit out basically every part of the Sails news, Sails generate process can be overridden. So that way you can have CoffeeScript controllers or TypeScript controllers or whatever, right? And that was good, that I thought. But the thing is, they just keep coming, this sort of stuff. And if there's probably 2 things that I want to communicate today for anyone that's currently maintaining an open source project or is looking to. You have to keep in mind that everybody wants different things, and they're going to be bringing them. They're going to be coding them at some point, whether they do it themselves or they find an existing library. So your obligation to your own project, I think, is to do only what you need, and then make it as easy as possible for other people who need other things to add them, right? So, and yeah, that's an issue from like last week. People just want more Gulp generators from core, right? The great news is now, someone has gone and made a Gulp generator for every single piece of the Sails new kind of flow. People just need a link to it now, right? So basically, takeaway from that is, number 1, write code that you need. And don't write code if you're not sure that you need to have it extrapolated. So this guy Kenton once told me something that really stuck with me. probably one of the best pieces of advice I got as a developer ever. And that was, don't ever try to extrapolate something or make it reusable until you've written the same thing 3 times. So I think that applies here, and especially even in the community. If there's 3 different people that need the same thing, or if there's 3 different use cases from the same person, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. That's the great thing about open source is you can kind of share that burden. But then they can send a pull request. And a lot of pull requests are literally just what that person needs, right? And I think the other obligation we have as open source maintainers and contributors is to push back on that and to try to make it something that really tries to pull that detail or that dependency out of the project. And that's something I've realized later on and had to kind of retrofit onto Sails over time. Luckily, the hook system got in there early enough that it's pretty easy to disable things and enable things. But yeah, and people that submit pull requests are usually really happy to make some tweaks or modify the way they're doing it. So you just got to ask. Okay, so the other part of this, my learning experience about open source in general was how the whole ecosystem actually worked. So I had been in IRC a little bit before, and I was on the OpenStack Google group. But there's like a very specific set of tools. I talked to Brian LaRue, the guy behind PhoneGap, and this guy, Phil Madge. And both of them had some great advice there, which is the first thing you do when you start an open source project that you care about and you want to have the community have a way to talk to each other and stuff, is make a Google group. Not because Google groups are good, but because for whatever reason, that's what people use. And that's what like the really early adopters like. It goes to your email, it gets annoying, eventually you filter it, but it's conventional. Same thing for IRC. There's, especially in the Node community, there's 1,000 ways you could chat with each other. But IRC has this magical thing to it where it just sort of, it's like the promised land. People just go to your IRC channel if it exists. Because people leave it open all day, right? And they idle in there. And you never know who's going to be online. Usually this guy, Rob W., actually, who's awesome. And then so Stack Overflow is an obvious thing that probably came about, I don't think it was even around 10 years ago. And Stack Overflow just basically owns Google now. So if you're searching for the answer to any question, in the past, like there's a guy that from InfoChimps in Austin, and what he mentioned once was that you could make a page that was just a common error from your tool or from your module and just paste that error message into the blog post, and then you would get SEO traffic from that. But Stack Overflow has pretty much solved that problem, which is great. So it's not it's no longer kind of like going into this walled garden. Anyone can do that, and it can be anyone's question. Cool. And GitHub issues, I'm sure we've all used those before, but basically that's a lot of times where stuff that really belongs in Google Groups ends up. And the other responsibility that you kind of have is taking that stuff and trying to close it so that it doesn't look like you have 300 issues. Although I think right now we have 120, so it goes up and down as far as how good I am about that. So another thing is like metrics that you don't really realize when you first start with something like this, but the way we all evaluate modules that we're going to use is, we might read the code if we're being thorough, if it's something we're really going to depend on. But a lot of times we look and see like, okay, how many GitHub stars does it have? And then if you're looking on NPM, you say like, okay, how many downloads does it have? Just really basic, superficial heuristics that give kind of give a little bit of ethos to it. The Google Group membership is not always publicized, but you can kind of see how active the thing is. And there's sort of this idea that like, well, if Homeboy over there is using it, I guess it's safe for me to use it too. And I think actually a much better metric is how many people are sitting there in the IRC channel all day, and also how many questions have been asked about a project. And how many of them have been answered. So you can actually go on Stack Overflow and see what percentage of questions have been answered about a project or a tag. Of course, getting the tag in the first place takes a while. Right, and then the last piece of advice before we start doing a little bit of coding, I think, is well, a few things. So the first is if you have a project that other people are going to be using, you really just got to have some empathy for them, right? And because you need to have empathy for yourself, because those people are the same people as you. You're using the module. So doing JS doc or Java doc comments is usually not enough. You want to have some kind of structured, like handwritten documentation that accompanies your project, because otherwise it's like, if you've read the Backbone annotated source, it's really great that that is there. But if that was all that was there, no one would have used Backbone, right? Also, having something you can copy and paste pretty much is that's what I do, right? I don't know how many of you guys scroll down to the answer when you click on a Stack Overflow question. Curious. Yeah, all right, cool. Not alone. All right, cool. So what I like to do is write docs in Markdown, and then there's actually a number of different libraries you can use for this, but there's something called Mark that I like, and then we have this thing wrapped around it called Doc Templater, which you guys should check out if you're doing any kind of large-scale documentation. But basically, it pulls down from GitHub or whatever Git repo you put the URL to, and then converts the Markdown files, any Markdown files it finds recursively there, or in a configurable subfolder, into HTML. And then you can take that HTML and pre-process it, add an Angular directive. We do that for types, right? So anytime it's like type string, we wrap it in 2 parentheses, which means turn it into a little bubble. So we've had pretty good luck with that. It took a while to get that workflow down. Once it was there, it was good. And it gives people a way to go in and just edit the docs in GitHub and send a pull request without actually having to go to the command line or anything, which is great. And to kind of do the point earlier, like the goal of open source in general is, if you think about dry or don't repeat yourself, it's the same kind of idea with open source, except now there's just more people. So the goal kind of becomes like, if there's a piece of your project that someone else could use, it would be nice for you to pull it out for them to be able to use it, right? But the more important thing is, even for you, likely you're going to want to use that separate module later. So even just selfishly, look at your own self-interest. If you pull out a module, chances are you'll end up actually using it yourself. So that's why I think open source is just going to continue to proliferate in the world. So anyways, to sum up what you should do for your own open source projects, make an IRC channel, make a Google group, and if you're looking to promote it, put some stuff on YouTube, because YouTube is crazy, apparently. People love to watch videos. But don't promote stuff in GitHub issues and in other people's projects, because that's really annoying and everyone hates it. And use YouTube for that. So yeah, and then finally the last thing is, if you look at the most popular projects on GitHub, most of them involve front-end development, and usually web development. So like I think number 1 is definitely Bootstrap. I think number 5 is a plugin for fonts or something like that. So it's crazy just to see how much of a difference there is between the numbers of front-end versus back-end developers. But I think it's really awesome, because what's happened is now you have so many more people that can do stuff and create code. Sometimes without as much experience, but that's where we have to come in and make it more robust. And if you look at like Firebase and Parse, I'm working on something similar to that in some ways. There's going to be a lot of tools that make it easier for less technical people to build backends. And I think we're going to be able to get to the point where those are commoditized. Probably not next year, probably not for a number of years, but in the same way that platform as a service has solved a lot of problems, or the fact that you can just get a cloud server. I think we're headed that direction for backend development. So I want to write some code, and so I rushed through that. Sorry, just a little brief. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions about that so far?
Yeah, so you mentioned for the docs, you use Mark, is that right, the Mark module?
Yeah.
Is that the only one you need to do what you just talked about doing?
Well, so let me look and see, actually.
I'm working on a similar problem, so I'm interested in what pieces you're doing in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is Doc Templater. In Doc Templater, we're using a wrapper for Git. So to be able to pull from a Git repo, we're using a wrapper for FS Extra. And yeah, async Lodash. Yeah, and then that's just a wrapper for the marked module that kind of normalizes it to have the same function signature.
Mark like a bunch of
Oh, well, let's see.
That's the part. I know that it can transform Markdown to HTML. I haven't looked into the rest, but I can look it up myself.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think like, yeah, I'm looping over it in here.
So you've got your own disk provider that for the Git stuff, yeah.
Totally, yeah. And if you actually, the Sails website uses this, so you can see, and it's open source, so you can see. I don't know if I'm online right now, but yeah, if you go to github.com, Balderdash, www.sails.js.org, and look in the, I think, doc compiler service or something like that, there's some code that requires this module, and then it does the, it has a little lifecycle hook to do the conversion of the double parenthesis things into bubbles. So,
I'll look that up.
cool, no problem.
How many active contributors do you have?
Well, depends on your definition of active, I guess. Regular. I think, I mean, I'm on the internet right now, but I think that there are, if you look at like the GitHub number of contributors, that's getting close to 100. I work on it pretty much every day, at least if it's not Sails, it's one of the related modules. There's also Cody, Particle Banana, who maintains Waterline. He works with me, and Scott also works with me. Loic, a guy in Paris, was one of our interns for the summer, so he's been largely full-time on Sails. He's building a CMS on top of it called Extensio. His friend and comrade in that adventure is Hugo. So Hugo's also working quite a lot on Sails right now. So those are the people that I know have been like fully committed, either getting paid or working full-time on it for a period of time. We've also had other people, in and out that have worked on it. Nick did the first version of Doc Templater, and most of the code in there is still his code. So he kind of has looked after the docs, and he put together the new docs for 0.10. Beyond that, I mean, I think I have 21 pending pull requests right now that I need to look at. But yeah, it's pretty active. There's usually one or so contributions a day.
Yeah, my question is sort of a follow-on. How do you manage pull requests between all these?
Well, so there's that's a good question. So it gets harder the longer you go without dealing with it, because what starts to happen is you'll have had to patch something, and then you'll have to manually merge. So I think the best way is to be proactive. So I'm not exhibiting that right now because we have a lot built up, because we've been pretty booked with client work for the last 8 weeks, I think. But what helps a lot is to have someone whose job it is, or if it's not their job, just someone from the community that has some time looking to contribute, that is kind of vigilant for anything that looks like a really serious issue, right? Because that keeps you from having to go in there and manually look at it every day, which means that you can then spend like a Saturday all day and work on it, and you won't have backed up all of your work from the week. So we have Courtney, who's our kind of community manager, communications coordinator, goes in and tries to look for anything that's blaringly obvious. And then we also have Earl, the guy behind Salescast, who helps us out. And Rob W. and RW Overdick, or Overdeek, are super helpful there too. So I guess kind of elect community members. Is there another question over there? Cool. So there's some of you guys haven't actually seen Sails yet, so I thought maybe just doing a quick little demo would be instructive. Do you know the password?
No. Yeah. Open world 24.
Like that? Okay, cool. So actually, before I do this, let me show you guys just kind of what the workflow looks like. So Sails new, and then whatever the name of your project is going to create a new directory. And I've got quite a few of them in there, obviously. So what's in that directory is a lot like what you might be familiar with from Rails or any kind of relevant PHP framework or whatever. You've got controllers, models. you have views. Views are an interesting topic that we could talk more about if anyone's curious, but or wants to ask any questions. Just because things are becoming increasingly API focused, right? So views is probably one of the least commonly used directories these days for us, at least. But yeah, I mean, so controllers are kind of your, they're bundles of request handling code. So you'll have actions in there just like you would in Rails. Policies are a lot like helpers in Rails. So policies, you can actually chain them together. And policies are just Express middleware. So I guess if you aren't familiar with Sails, it's built on top of Express very tightly. And it also is built on top of Socket.io, which that's optional, just like HTTP is optional as well if you want to use it for something else. But yeah, so a policy is just like a piece of Express middleware that checks to see if it should continue or it stops, right? It sends a response. And the idea with policies is you can go in and configure them. So like this example that we bundle is like rabbit controller. By default, you can't do anything to the rabbits, but you can nurture the rabbits if you're the rabbit's mother. And if you're going to feed the rabbits, you have to be nice to animals and have food. So that's kind of the idea there. It's really so you can think about, it's a separation of concerns for your authentication code or authorization code from your main request handling code. So that if you're in a controller writing some code, you already have confidence that you don't have to check to see if someone's logged in. And you can assume you have a session if you then wrap that in a policy. So anyways, one of the things that is pretty cool about Sails is you can do this. And Sails Generate API is something that will create a model and controller, and it just creates an empty model and controller. So it's kind of like doing scaffolds in something like Rails or Django. But the difference is you end up getting an API. So if I go to /user, you can see that's an empty JSON response because I have no users in my database currently. But if I create a user names, I got a few in here already, Sherry, Lena, Pongo, maybe. Now I've got 3 users. And then I can do stuff like query on those. So I'm doing this just on the URL bar right now. But if I open up Postman and do, if I do a GET request, this is just a little REST client here. You can see it's the same sort of thing. I can do, so if I do name equals Sherry, I can look up users using this too, right? Because this is something that is the same pretty much every time you do it. You'll do pagination, you'll do sort, you'll do filtering of some kind. You might do more complex filtering. You normally have a way to update things. You normally have a way to create new things and then destroy things. And you might want to update or destroy using a criteria as well. So kind of like what you do with SQL. So that's exposed by default in Sails. It's called blueprints. You can turn that off, and you can turn parts or all of it off, and you can re-enable it and bind it to specific routes. But the idea is especially when you're doing some prototyping on the front end, and you're doing like a autocomplete field that shows you a list of users that match your search query or whatever, it's nice not to write code for that, at least not right away. And then as you need to, you can actually wrap it in policies. And then eventually, if you get to the point where, OK, this is getting a little too crazy, you can just go ahead and write some actual code to handle the request. But let's try one that's a little bit more complicated. So, and this looks kind of ugly. It makes a lot more sense if you're doing it through something like jQuery. But if I do where name contains the letter A, you can see like Sherry and Lena both contain the letter A. You can do greater than, less than, et cetera, or a SQL-like query. Oops. All right, like that. And I think I kind of messed that up, but I think I need to URL escape it. But that's yeah, so that's blueprints in a nutshell. Probably one of the things that people miss most when they first are getting started, or they have trouble with sometimes, is when to switch between blueprints and not blueprints anymore. And really the easy answer for that is just when you're spending more time dealing with the details of blueprints than you are actually thinking about your business logic. So right now, what this basically is doing is it's as if I wrote a find action. and a create and an update and a destroy action. And then it's as if I went into the routes file and bound get/user to user controller dot find, and post to create, put to update, and delete to destroy. So it's just doing that by default for you, right? And inside of the config folder, there's this blueprints.js file, and you can turn off the automatic routing. And you can still always use the actual controller itself. So that happens actually quite a lot. And we'll use it in production if we have, usually we'll turn off all blueprints in production just so we can explicitly see every route we have. But in, even in production, we'll still sometimes route directly to a blueprint action, just because then you can do stuff like that. As long as you don't need to check to see, like maybe you're not allowed to see the entire list of users, right? And in that case, you want to put a policy on this to say only the admin user can do that. So anything in particular you guys want to see?
We do some of the socket stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. Good point. I always forget that. OK, so I actually have an example I did before a conference a while ago. I'm going to open up this cursors project. And it's the deprecated messages because I have a locally linked version of Sails on here. Working on doing the Express 4 upgrade. OK, so this is, I think you guys can actually go to my IP address if you're on the network and you got a laptop handy. I'm just going to assume it's 192. It's probably not.
Probably their like firewall stuff.
Let's see, it's worth a shot. Maybe. Can you guys hit that? There we go. I'll close one of my windows. So this is using blueprints just for the back end, because you can think it's just a model called cursor, and the cursors have an X position and a Y position. And it's really dumb, right? I mean, this was like 15 minutes of hacking really quick. So there's every time I refresh the page, I'm going to get a new cursor, and the color kind of gets randomly assigned. You can also chat if you type down there. It's pretty basic, and all that's doing is an update. But here's the thing about the real-time stuff, at least as far as blueprints, right? So putting everything else aside for a second, and if you think about if you're making an app that you want to be completely real-time, right? You think maybe that if you're finding stuff, like you were finding these cursors, a lot of times you want to actually maybe get updated when that stuff you found changes. So this API is going to return, this is using my local disk database, so it's probably actually going to be rather slow. What you're seeing on the screen is actually cursors from I think from the last 15 seconds. And that's just because I'm using a blueprint find request. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so I'm just looking for cursors that were updated sometime within the last 15 seconds. But yeah, I mean, so this was an app I wanted to go put on the open internet. There's a few things I'd want to do. I'd want to put it on an actual server and not my laptop, obviously, right? I'd want to probably want to hook it up to a different database than local disk DB, and I'd want to I probably want to do some stuff to prevent just the constant creation of new records, maybe throttle, and also I could use the session to recognize that someone is the same person when they refresh the page. Right? Maybe write some login code, sign up with Facebook, whatever. So that's where I would start writing actions. But at this point, this is a little Angular app that's like, 100 lines of code or something, 200 lines of code. And that's really where, if someone was asking me to do this project, there's the Teletubbies in there, I would probably start this way, because this at least lets me show something immediately, which customers always like, stakeholders, whoever, even you. It's good just to see whether it works, right? And then you can take this and layer on the backend functionality you need in addition. So it's kind of like starting with something like Firebase and then continuing forward. But the idea is that it's just as easy as plugging in Node functions, just like you would with an Express app. But anyways, yeah, to finish the thought on the pub/sub stuff, it looks like my screen's getting slower and slower. But with the pub/sub stuff, when you do a find, you're getting subscribed to every instance that you found, right? So if you found 30 records, there's 30 Socket.io rooms, and you are now joined in each of those rooms. If one of those records gets updated and someone calls publish update, and that's what's happening by default in the Blueprint actions, then it's going to broadcast that update to everyone who's subscribed. So anyone who is actually able to find it then gets subscribed to it. Creating is a little bit more complicated. It's not in this case, but a lot of times you care because if you're able to find like 13 users who are your friends, let's say you're making a social app, you might want to hear about certain changes from those users, right? And you can restrict what you end up publishing on. But you may not want to be able to hear about the creation of any new user. You might want to hear about the creation of a user who's also creating their account via your invite email or something, right? And in that case, it gets a little bit trickier because you actually want to write some custom code to think about whether you want to broadcast this information to everybody. But you know what? I mean, if that's the first time you have to write code in something like this, that's a good start. See if it, OK, so people who hadn't moved the cursor in 15 seconds got wiped there. But if you refresh the page, it'll show up again, I think. Anything else on that? Go ahead, sorry. Yeah, totally. There's a generator called Sails.js that's good, and it uses Passport. I did a couple of examples because that's a common question. Which actually, back to the open source thing in general for a second, I found that it's not like the stream of issues never ends. It's like when there's things that are not documented enough or there's not a tutorial that shows how to do it, issues for that particular type of thing just tend to keep coming in. So that is one of the things, it's really easy to then look at your issues and say, OK, wow, 30 of them were about this. So there's this GitHub organization called Sails 101 where I've done, used to what I would do is when I wasn't sure if something was tested enough in the unit tests. One is you write more tests, but if it's to answer a quick question, I would go make these Sails projects, like usually in that sandbox folder I was doing earlier, and then I would test it out, and then I would respond to people. So the goal of this was just like, I'm just going to open source every one of those whenever I do that so that I don't keep wasting that and redoing it every time. So anyways, there's one in here called file uploads. It's really helpful. And then there's one called using Passport and basic login. So basic login, I'll start there because the Passport thing is, it absolutely works just fine. It works just like it does in Express. Passport actually adds something to the HTTP incoming message prototype globally on the process. And that's one of the ways that it works. So in order to make that also work with sockets and Sails, you have to go in and kind of hack on, you have to basically monkey patch Passport. And you can do it in lots of different ways. I talk about it more in the using Passport example. But that's why I wanted to do basic login without Passport, just to show how you would do it, because it's really not any harder. Basically, I have 3 custom actions: log in, log out, and sign up. So I made a custom response called res.login, but that was just to kind of also show how custom responses work. Basically, in here, you just set something in your session if it was a successful login. In logout, you just delete that thing from the session. And then to sign up, you set the thing in the session like that, and then you create the user. And I made a custom model method here, again, to try to have a thinner controller and demonstrate how to go about that. Is that a good start, or would it be helpful to? OK, awesome. I saw another hand over here.
For the setup that you're doing when you run Sails with, is there a graphical way to do that, or is there going to be a graphical way to do that?
The setup is in, what do you mean? Sorry.
I mean, the steps that you do before you do the Sails.
Like generating the API or whatever. Probably not exactly that, but yeah, I definitely, we're actively working on a project that hopefully will be something kind of the next phase of things for me that is that kind of system on top of Sails. So soon, I hope. Yeah.
On the client side, you're not full stack framework in the sense of
Right, not at all. So we're an API framework, and reason for that is, we from the very beginning, a lot of times we'd be building a PhoneGap app or building a native iOS app or building a website, and so we kind of had that need ourselves. And looking back at it, it was a great thing to happen into. We had something called Mast, and Mast used to be actually part of Sails at the very beginning. It was a lot more like something like Meteor, but instead of going with that approach, we kind of ripped off the front end part and said, no, you're going to be able to use whatever you want. And that was good because we completely switched from using Backbone for a lot of things at work. But we still, we maintain some Backbone projects, and we do Angular mainly now. So it was good. Yeah.
Why Sails instead of nails or tails or?
Or jails, right? Well, so if you think about what are the two most likely options, Node on nails, right? I just picture this sort of like shirtless man laying on this bed of sharp, pointy things. Exactly. Or JavaScript on jails or in jails, right? Which is just a little creepy too. So it made the most sense. And the distinction between that and the Sails with an E word is confusing sometimes, but it's okay. I don't ever talk about the other kind of Sails anyways.
Well, how much of this lines of code are written for a business to use, and how much is hobby or learning and things like that? And how do you feel as an open source person, like what that balance is in accomplishing your vision?
That's a really hard question to answer, because I think that probably most of us in this room are people who like to code, even if it's just a little bit, probably a lot. And one of the hardest things to do, it kind of goes back to that, if you're writing it 3 times, then extrapolate it thing. I really tried hard not to write this framework. I tried really hard. Like I Googled for a long time, like a day, even. And because it was like, I knew it was going to be a lot of work. And even then, I avoided writing Waterline because that was going to take even more time, and the database is scary, and it takes a lot of thought. But the thing that actually, I don't think this ever would have happened if we weren't doing it to enable work that we had to do because we were getting paid for it. Just because otherwise we'd probably end up focusing on something that wasn't immediately relevant, or I probably would have continued to work on Mast and had this full stack thing. And I'm so glad it worked out the way it did, because it's a lot more useful for not just me, but for everybody who's doing all kinds of different front-end stuff. So yeah, as far as my personal time on the project, yeah, I still spend a lot of personal time on it, and I focus on stuff I probably shouldn't. But you got to do a little bit of that.
You mentioned using Angular. Do you have any Angular-oriented generators or anything to help bootstrap that kind of rapid sort of thing?
Sort of. So there's a bunch of, if you search like Angular Sails, first of all, there's an Angular Sails project, which is just a wrapper around the Socket.io client. And that's actually largely been done by this guy, Rob W. I was talking about earlier. And it's great. There's also a bunch of different seed projects that people have done. I have not tried them out too much. What we usually do is just go in and kind of in this assets folder, just toss Angular in there. And that's largely just because Bower troubles me, and just because it gets so many files, I don't know, whatever. That's my own, I'm just neurotic, I guess. But typically we'll have in here like a directives folder, we call them controls usually on the front end, just to be less ambiguous, that it's they're like UI controllers, but, and then factories, which we use a lot like models on the front end with Angular, for customer stuff. And I actually did do Sails generate directive recently, I think. Yeah. Yeah, so it generates something like this. You can configure the module. I think I open sourced it. Oops, not Angular directive. Yeah, so anyone can make a generator, by the way. It's actually pretty simple. You just go in and make this, there's this before function, which is just like, it actually kind of works a little bit like Angular because you have this cascading scope syntax, or environment, I guess. And so the before is where you can kind of like parse the command line parameters or whatever you want. And then the targets is just, okay, make this file and use this template. And it's just using Balderdash templates. So it's real simple, like the most basic thing you could do. So there is, I think, Sails generate directive and Sails generate factory for Angular. I think they're on NPM too. I think we're probably running out of time. Anyone got any other last minute questions? I'll be around too afterwards. Thank you.